astounding. All right, good morning. Thank you to everyone that braved Snowmageddon 3, I guess it is now for us. Pretty brutal out there. It's a little cold this morning, but I'm glad you all made it, and this should be a great Grand Rounds for you. So just first, this is the Don Olson Memorial Lectureship, as you all are very familiar with. Several years ago, we decided to combine with Providence St. Vincent's, and when we have visiting professors and these endowed lectures, they speak at both med centers to kind of give us greater exposure to folks. So this is a lectureship sponsored by the Providence St. Vincent Medical Center Foundation. The acknowledgement for Dr. Olson states that he was an extraordinary teacher, mentor, and physician for over 40 years. He was described as having a wonderful humility and sincerity and continuous quest for knowledge that really bonded him with his patients. And the purpose of this lecture is to invite luminary speakers who display a passion for humanism in medicine and a deep respect for the doctor-patient relationship, which I think certainly describes our visiting professor today, Dr. Quinn Capers. Dr. Capers is someone I've known for many years from working at The Ohio State University. He originally got his BS from Howard University in D.C., his MD from The Ohio State University, and yes, we're going to do the proper pronunciation throughout the discussion here. He then did his residency down south at Emory University, where he also did the triple fellowships of interventional cardiology, cardiology and then interventional cardiology, and vascular biology research all at Emory. He had a variety of positions. He was in private practice for several years and then joined the Ohio State Division of Cardiology in 2007, I believe, correct? Yes. Once he joined Ohio State, he has had several roles in leadership positions. Most notably now, he is the Interventional Cardiology Fellowship Program Director. He arrived and started the transradial artery technique for cardiac stenting at Ohio State and ran that program, and I think continues to run transradial coronary interventional program at Ohio State. His biggest impact, I think, however, has been both on the training program, and then he has been an associate dean at the College of Medicine since 2009. And just a couple clear anecdotes of his impact. Prior to 2007, and I remember this very well, Ohio State had never trained an African American cardiology fellow, and we wound up on the American Black Cardiologists Association Wall of Shame for having never done so, which got a lot of people's attention appropriately. And Quinn got very involved in that and co-authored, or was a senior author on a paper noting the dramatic turnaround to where now in the recent fellowship class at Ohio State there were 25% of the fellows who are African American, so quite a difference with a lot of work on Quinn and others' part. And then the College of Medicine since 2009, he's had a dramatic impact. We had a large increase in applications at that institution, mainly from women as well. And then, of course, a large impact on underrepresented minorities directly due to efforts both to reach out to them and then, in line with what he's going to talk about today, training in implicit bias for those who are selecting and reviewing those. He's done over 100 implicit bias workshops and trained over 1,000 physicians and healthcare workers. And today he's going to talk about implicit bias in healthcare and medical school admission. So welcome, Quinn.
Thank you so much. So thank you, John, for such a wonderful introduction, and thank you for the invitation. So Dr. Mastronardi was kind enough to extend this invitation to me. My first time in Portland, in the greater Northwest. So I'm glad to be here, and I really thank you for your attention. I became interested in this topic, implicit bias, the notion that we all have unconscious likes and dislikes that we don't even know about. but even though we don't know about them, they can impact our decision making. I became intrigued with this topic first as somebody who cares about healthcare disparities, looking for what could be some of the causes of healthcare disparities. The fact that two people with the same disease can get different levels of treatment. But also, when I became Dean of Admissions in the medical school, of course, we want to make fair and just decisions. So I also then became even more intrigued with this topic and did a deep dive on it, and I'm pleased to be able to share with you some of my thoughts on this topic. I have no disclosures. So this is the heart of what got me interested in this topic. The fact that what is happening all over the country, and I'll show you some data, that you can have two patients with the same diagnosis, same symptoms, same history, same objective findings, and they can receive different levels of quality of care. All too often, in this scenario, the white patient would be the one most likely to get the highest quality of patient-centered care. Now, if you were to say that to these doctors, if you were to say, gee, doctor, do you realize you're treating your black and white patients differently? Well, you'd better be ready to have a fight on your hands, because they will debate with you for 24 hours. They say that's not true. And that's because that's not who they want to be. That really is not who they want to be. I really feel like doctors are humanitarians. But our unconscious mind can often hijack our good intentions. So a few definitions: implicit bias is a positive or negative attitude towards a person, thing, or group that again is occurring outside of our conscious control. Of course, contrast it to explicit bias, so we know what we like and don't like consciously. There is a test, a computer-based test, implicit association tests, that have been well validated and can actually give you some insight into what some of your unconscious associations or preferences or biases are. And there is one for just about everything you can think of. So if you haven't taken one of those tests, I recommend that you do. By the way, let me just see a show of hands. How many of you have taken one or more implicit association tests? Okay, so a good number of you. An incredible journey in self-awareness, if you will. As you know, if you go to the website, and it is projectimplicit.org, projectimplicit.org, and take these tests, you'll see there's a whole menu of them. One of them that we're going to spend a good bit of time talking about is the race BlackWhite IIT. And there is a result you can get on that BlackWhite IIT called implicit white race preference. What does that mean? If I have implicit white race preference, what that means is that when I see a white face, when I see a white person's face, my mind automatically, unconscious mind, automatically associates it with good things, happiness, joy, love. And that when I see a black person's face, my unconscious mind automatically associates it with bad things: fear, violence, misery, pain, danger, etc. So that's called implicit white race preference. We'll revisit that a few times. Well, we all have these implicit biases. This really is just how our brains work. And actually, they can be protective, these unconscious associations or preferences. The IAT is only one. There are other online tests that you can take. But these implicit biases and the results on these implicit bias tests have been associated with discriminatory behaviors in the education system, in the criminal justice system, and in what we do in the healthcare system. This is maybe the most important slide I can show you today, and that is that implicit white race preference does not equal racism. They're not the same. The difference has everything to do with awareness and intent and control. So an example of racism would be if I said, you know, I don't like to be around black males because they're dangerous. If I say that, if I feel that way, well, it's not a secret to me that I feel that way. I'm aware that I feel that way. So that is not an implicit bias at all. That's an explicit bias. The implicit bias correlate of that would be if my unconscious mind, when it sees a black male's face, automatically, reflexively associates it with danger. Now, that can be completely counter to how I feel consciously. So you can't get mad at me if my unconscious brain is doing that. My unconscious brain is simply doing pattern recognition. That's really all this is. If you've seen something many, many times through the years, your unconscious brain tries to do you a favor and says, okay, well, these two things must go together. On a more simpler example is if every time growing up, if every time I saw a tiger, that tiger was devouring something, and there are two exits to this auditorium, and there's a tiger sitting by one of them, I don't have to contemplate. I don't have to say, I wonder which of these exits should I take. My unconscious mind says tiger equals something getting devoured. So it really is an adaptive response. Our brains are trying to help us out, but as I'll show you, they can really have some harmful consequences. So racism is a conscious decision. Implicit racial bias is an unconscious coupling. We take stimuli that we see every day. In fact, neuroscientists tell us that the brain is bombarded by 11 million stimuli a day. And of course, you'd never get your work done if you tried to sit and contemplate each of those. So the vast majority of them you ignore. But even though you're ignoring them consciously, your unconscious mind is always recording. And I like to say your unconscious mind, it's you with a pen and a notepad taking notes. You're just taking notes. And those notes then become the foundations for these unconscious associations or preferences. Two things that are often seen together, our unconscious mind will say these things are the same. Let's go back to our early science classes. We all remember Pavlov's experiments with the dogs, right? You feed the dog and ring the bell at the same time. After doing that hundreds or thousands of times, the sound of the bell makes a dog's mouth water. That's because in that dog's unconscious mind, bell ringing and mealtime have become fused. They're the same. Well, we're animals too, so our brains work that way too. Now, be honest, how many of you are like me? When you see this symbol, you can smell coffee. You can smell coffee being roasted. That's because so often when I'm standing and I see this symbol, I'm standing somewhere where I'm smelling coffee. So that my unconscious brain can say that they're the same. Of course, we know they're not the same. That is an example of a harmless unconscious association, but they can be harmful. What if every time, or most of the time in your life, you've seen this, it was accompanied by this? Your unconscious brain could say they're the same. And even though that could be quite counter to how you feel consciously, if your unconscious brain makes this association and you're on an elevator and a young black man in a hoodie gets on that elevator, then that can affect how you behave and how you treat him. So let's talk about some of these stimuli that we receive that, again, it's your unconscious brain taking notes that then become these unconscious couplings or associations or preferences or biases. Here are some pictures from Hurricane Katrina when, as you remember, much of New Orleans was underwater. And there were many people who did not evacuate when the authorities told them to, maybe because they just had no resources to evacuate. So, as you know, it took a long time for some of those people to be rescued, and some of them were literally starving to death. And they took matters into their own hands. So these photos came out on the same day, August 30th, with the accompanying captions that went out on the Associated Press. The picture up top says a young man walks through chest-deep floodwater after looting a grocery store. The one at the bottom says 2 residents wade through chest-deep water after finding bread and soda. Looting, finding. Seems to me they're doing the same thing. They're starving to death and took matters into their own hands to go get some food. But the one with the dark skin is looting. The ones with the light skin are finding. Now, you may not pay attention to this as you're reading through the newspaper. It might just filter into the back of your mind. But your unconscious mind, which is you taking notes, says, oh, okay, I got it. Well, let me write this down. So black people loot and white people find. That's an example of stimuli that we take in that over the years become preferences or associations. Let me show you something similar. It's a video. Hopefully this video will play. Oh, before we get to the video. So I've been at Ohio State now for 12 years. And the OSU Police Department sends out safety alerts to let everybody know, hey, there's something going on campus. You may want to be careful. It seems like there's one of these safety alerts almost every month, you know. And so here's one that caught my attention because in my 12 years at Ohio State, these almost monthly safety alerts, this is the only time they sent a photo. It's usually just a description, usually just printed words. But this time they sent a photo. And what's happened here is somebody's going into the dorm, stealing cash, credit cards, and electronics from dorm rooms. So this was the alert. They attached a photo. Now, I've covered this young man's eyes, but I can tell you, I would bet you all the money that you have that you know somebody that somewhat resembles this young man. And so if you do, you're supposed to call the police. So call the police if you know somebody that looks like this. Now, I'm not here to talk about this young man's guilt or innocence. For all I know, he might have done it. But the point I'm making is that these images that are around us all the time help to cement this narrative in our unconscious brain that a black male's face equals crime or equals danger. Let me show you now this video.
Meantime, 2 teenagers are wounded on the city's south side. It happened at East 74th. There's an 18-year-old man in...
So let me give you some background. This is a news clip that played in the city of Chicago. We all know what's happening in Chicago. Tragically, it's become kind of the murder capital, so much gun violence. Often, not always, but often, it is a black person shooting and killing a black person. So that's happened here. There's been a shooting. The reporters are going to interview the bystanders. So I'm going to give you a couple of assignments for this clip. They interview a 4-year-old boy. So I'm going to ask you, please pay attention. What did the 4-year-old little boy say? The second assignment is they then go back to the anchor desk. And what does the anchor say? What do you hear the anchor say when they go back to the news desk? So what did the 4-year-old little boy say, and what does the anchor say?
16-year-old girl were hit while standing on the sidewalk. The male's in good condition while the girl's expected to recover. And kids on the street as young as 4 were there to see it all unfold and had a disturbing reaction.
No, I'm not scared of nothing.
When you get older, you gonna stay away from all these guns?
No.
No?
No.
What do you want to do when you get older?
I'm gonna have me a gun.
Because I live right here and I don't want none of my family members to get shot.
That is very scary indeed. So far, no suspects are in custody.
Okay, so ready for your quiz? What did the little boy say? I'm going to get me a gun. Did he say it kind of shy and bashful and timid? Or did he say it with swagger? I'm going to get me a gun. The latter? Okay. So, and what did you hear? Did you hear what the anchor said when they went back to the news desk? That is very scary indeed. And I actually think that the impact of those words are greater when you don't see the anchor. So it's almost like the omnipotent narrator in a novel is telling you this is how you're supposed to feel about what you just saw. Think for a minute about that clip, which millions saw that in the Chicagoland area, and how it makes you feel about, first, let's say how it makes you feel about that neighborhood. Do you want to drive through a neighborhood where the 4-year-olds are packing? Second, what it makes you feel about, whether you think it consciously or not, what it makes you feel about those people. Right? What's wrong with them? This little boy just saw somebody get shot, and his response is, I'm going to get me a gun too. Let me show you that same interview from a different perspective. Please listen closely.
That's what I like to hear. You ain't scared of nothing. Damn. When you get older, you gonna stay away from all these guns?
No.
No?
No.
What do you want to do when you get older?
I'm gonna have me a gun.
You are? Why you want to do that? You know what happens when
I'm gonna be the police.
Okay, well then you can...
So what he was saying was, I'm going to get me a gun because I'm going to be a police officer to protect my neighborhood from this crime. But somebody at that news station saw fit to clip and edit it the way you saw it that played to millions in the Chicagoland area. So think about for a minute that clip as an example. The picture of the young college student with a hat on that to me looks like any young male college student I know. And looting versus finding. Multiply those stimuli over and over again, and really you ask yourself how any of us escape having an unconscious association of a black male with bad things like danger, violence, crime, misery, etc. And we're going to talk about how those unconscious biases can really affect other things. Stimuli, the world around us. So look at this billboard. So first of all, let me tell you, so I'm on Twitter. Let me see a show of hands. How many of you are on Twitter? I know John is. Oh, you got to get on Twitter. There are actually, there's a pretty impressive medical community on Twitter. So I'm on Twitter, and I just a few days ago, somebody posted something that enraged her. This was a woman physician. She was driving through Savannah, Georgia, and she saw this billboard. Now, this billboard, if you can't see it, it is 3 males with surgical caps and masks on, and the sign says, all cardiothoracic surgeons look like this. That's a bizarre ad campaign, right? What are they selling? So this started a mini storm on Twitter, and then the original poster came back and said, driving a few more miles down the road, there was another billboard where these men had the masks off and they were smiling. And so maybe the purpose of the ad was to say, well, our surgeons smile because they have good outcomes, or something like that. A terrible ad to me. I would have fired that ad company. But look at this and imagine a little boy looking at this ad, and imagine a little girl looking at this ad, staring at it. And then they both go home to do their homework. And then they get their report card. And the little boy gets what he thinks is not a good grade, a C. But he remembers this. And so he's fueled. I can do it. I can do it. I know I can do it because all cardiothoracic surgeons look like this. That little girl gets a C, and then a little bit of doubt starts to creep into her mind because she says, well, maybe I should just stop trying because all cardiothoracic surgeons look like this. This is the power of these images that are around us and how they can seep into our unconscious mind. So let me give you some examples of how these implicit association test results have been correlated with outcomes. So in the education field, this is a very interesting study. Teachers, school teachers, took the BlackWhite IIT, and then they had an experiment where they were shown photographs of children, either black or white children, whose mouths were either turned up in the same degree of a smile or turned down in the same degree of a frown or were neutral. The teachers looked at repeated photos and they were simply asked, when do you see anger or hostility? There were a group of teachers that were more likely to see anger in the black children than the white children, even though their mouths were held in the same position. But it wasn't all the teachers, but the teachers whose implicit association tests showed implicit white race preference. They were more likely to see anger in black children. You might think that that might equate to differences in punishments. And there is some evidence that possibly it does. In Ohio, K through 12, public schools, the rate of major disciplinary actions, either suspension, you got to get out of here for 3 days and come back, or expulsion, get out of here and don't come back, is 23 actions per 100 students, all comers, K through 12 public school. For minority students, it's triple, 68 actions per 100 students. Could those two be related? If I'm more likely to look at a black kid and say, hey, this kid is being insolent, this kid is angry, he's hostile, then I'm more likely maybe to give out a harsher punishment. Well, let's talk a little bit more about gender bias because there's evidence that even names can trigger biases. Not only what we see visually in terms of looking at somebody's face, but just a name. This is an interesting study. So this was done by one woman, an author, Catherine Nichols. She'd written a book. She knew it was the best thing she'd ever written. And as many of you in here may know, the way it works in the literary world is that the gatekeepers to the publishing houses are the literary agents. So if you got a book you want published, you send a chapter to the literary agents, and they either kill it on the spot or they decide to pass it on to the publishing house. So Catherine Nichols knew this was a great book. She sent it to 50 agents, a chapter. She said, now let me sit back and wait on the bidding war, because this is gold. I know this is gold. She waited and waited. She only got 2 responses, and they were negative. The comments were like this. Your main character isn't very plucky, is she? And very high quality, but unlikely that the entire book will maintain the same quality. So let's try to understand this critique. So this critic is saying This chapter is so good that I don't believe that the entire book will be as good, so that's going to be a no for us. Do you understand that, critic? So guess what she did? She was heartbroken, she was upset, but she had been reading about implicit bias. So guess what she did? She took the same chapter and sent it to another 50 agents, but this time she changed the name of the author to George. She got 17 responses, and they were all positive. They said things like clever, well-constructed, exciting, please send more. So she became an 8.5 times better writer by changing her name from Catherine to George. It was the same book chapter. And I know in here, I would bet there are probably some women in here who are thinking, what about that grant I submitted? What about that article that I submitted to that journal? Did the fact that the author's name was Mary instead of Bill impact what they thought of the quality of that writing? This is only one of several studies that indicates that, yes, that can be the case. So we're not superhumans, those of us working in healthcare. Each bullet that you see here is from a different study showing that physicians and pharmacists and nurses and medical students, specialists versus primary care physicians, all have these implicit racial, gender, sexuality, religion biases. This is maybe a landmark study in this area. Janice Sabin, who's at the University of Washington, not too far from here, and colleagues wrote this study. So that website where you go to take the implicit bias test, it asks you, it's anonymous, but it does ask you some demographic information about yourself, and it also asks you about your occupation. So what they did in this study is they tapped into that database looking at results on the BlackWhite implicit association test for those who said their occupation was physician versus everyone else. What they found is that in the everyone else, the people who are not physicians, 70% have implicit white race preference, which is in my unconscious mind, white is good and black is bad. 70%. You know how many of the physicians had implicit white race preference? 70%. So there was no difference between those who said they were a physician versus those who had other occupations. Implicit preference, these are quotes from the study, implicit preference for white Americans was strong among all MD groups except for African American MDs. And the first time you hear that, you're probably thinking, well, it's probably just group recognition. Of course, you're comfortable around people that you grew up with, so yes, white physicians have white preference, but probably Asian physicians have Asian preference and Hispanic physicians have Hispanic preference, but that's actually not what they found. They found that white, Asian, and Hispanic physicians all had white preference and this anti-black bias. The black physicians, some had black preference, some had white preference, but the larger group of them were actually neutral. So physicians have the same implicit biases as do people in other professions. What you and I, of course, want to know about that is, does that translate to care and what we do? Here's a study. It's an oldie but goodie, but it makes the point and hints at what could be going on out there. So in this study, it was done at the American College of Physicians annual meeting. So the researchers walked around the lobby of the convention center looking for volunteers, looking for internists who wanted to participate in this study. And if you decided to participate in the study, you went into a booth and you saw a film. In that film, you saw only one of these actors, only one. But they all read an identical script. And they all read the script that was pretending to be someone who was having chest pain that an internal medicine physician would know is threatening to have a heart attack. So they all said, it feels like a ton of bricks sitting on my chest. I couldn't breathe. It took my breath away. It radiated into my left arm. I was drenched in sweat, and I had this impending sense of doom. You don't have to be an interventional cardiologist to know, sounds like this patient's threatening to have a heart attack. Well, after seeing the video of only one of these actors, you then answer some questions. Buried in the middle of the questions was, would you refer this patient for a cardiac catheterization, which, as you know, is the procedure we do to see if you even have blocked heart arteries. And if you have them, we want to fix them before you have a heart attack. What they found was that it was the white males that were most likely by a large margin to be referred for cardiac catheterization. Who do you think was second most likely? It's okay. We're all friends. You can speak up. Who was second most likely? White females. White females were second. Who was third? Black males were third, and the black females were bringing up the rear. So in other words, when she complained of a ton of bricks sitting on her chest, taking away her breath, radiating down her left arm, and a drenching sweat, she was much less likely to be referred for a heart cath than when he said it. And now if you were to challenge the physicians and say, gee, doctor, are you aware that you treat your men and women differently? That you treat your black patients and your white patients differently? Again, you'd have a fight on your hands because they're not aware of that, and that's not who they want to be. They are well-intentioned people. I really believe that doctors are humanitarians, but our unconscious biases can hijack our good intentions. We know from both psychological research and from research in our literature, in the medical literature, how we interact with somebody who is in a group against which we have an unconscious negative bias. Each bullet point here is from a study in which a physician-patient interaction was taped with the consent of the physician and the patient. These physicians had taken implicit bias tests before the experiment. And what they found, all of these remarkably similar results, is that when a physician is interacting from somebody from a group against which they have an unconscious bias, the communication style is likely to be one called verbal dominance, which means I'm doing all the talking. I'm not asking you if you have any questions, and I'm cutting you off when you try to speak. So that's how we interact with people who are in a group against which we are biased. We have more information on how these interactions might go. This is from the social psychology research literature. It turns out when we are interacting with somebody from a group against which we're biased, we allow them less time to speak. We just said that. We smile less. Less eye contact. Fewer impromptu social comments. How about that game last night? So keep this in mind as we think about these interactions. So let's go to the cancer doctor. So this is, you got a very prestigious, outstanding cancer center right here. And I think about this study when I think about how anxiety-provoking it must be for a cancer patient on the day they're going to see the oncologist. Maybe that oncologist is going to tell you the chemo isn't working. Maybe they're going to tell you the CT scan saw some more lesions. Very anxiety-provoking. So here's what may be happening inside of some of these visits. In this study, 18 oncologists took the BlackWhite IIT and then started seeing their patients. They went about their business seeing their patients, and over several weeks saw over 100 black patients. The office visits this time were videotaped with the consent of the physician and the patient, of course, and graded by neutral observers. Here's what they found. The oncologists who had high marks for implicit white race preference, they found three things were happening in their visits with their black patients. First of all, their visit with the black patients were shorter in duration. Second of all, the communication style was this verbal dominance. This is what you have, this is what we're going to do, see you next time. Next. Third, they had the patients fill out patient satisfaction surveys. And wouldn't you know it, there was an inverse relationship, this is really fascinating to me, an inverse relationship between the doctor's implicit white race preference and the black patient's satisfaction with that office visit. And if you think about it, it's not like the patient is saying, I didn't really enjoy this visit with Dr. Jones because he has implicit white race preference. When they don't know that, but there's something in that interaction that leads them to think, I'm not so sure that this doctor really has my best interest at heart. I want to ask you something. Have you ever had a visit with a patient, either at the bedside or in the office, where you came out of that interaction just thinking to yourself, you know, I don't know why, but for some reason we just didn't connect. I went in there with my same humanitarian heart that I always do, but for some reason, it was an uncomfortable interaction. I'm not sure I really got through to him or her and I'm not sure that I really understand her. It could be that that was a time when you were interacting with somebody from a group against which you are unconsciously biased, even though consciously you may not have any bias at all. And this is not even from the same study. This study was published in 2013 in the Annals of Family Medicine, but another study that looked at doctors who had taken the implicit bias test and their interactions with their patients, and the patients, this is the patient's survey, patient satisfaction. This is the implicit bias of the doctor, and these are black patients, patient satisfaction. And you can see the higher the doctor's implicit white race preference, the lower were the black patient's satisfaction in several areas: in interpersonal treatment, in communication, in trust, and in contextual knowledge. Well, let's talk about some of the conversations that we have that are not comfortable conversations. And maybe we can see just about what the impact must be like. This was an interesting study published in 2016 that looked at physicians having that end-of-life discussion with our patients. So you know the discussion I'm talking about, that discussion where we have to say to our patients, look, we have been concentrating on a cure and getting you better, but nothing's working. I don't think you're going to survive an operation, and I don't think you'll survive the procedure. I think it's time for us to concentrate on making you comfortable. That conversation. 33 physicians completed 2 encounters with prognostically similar terminally ill black and white patients. The patient interaction was videotaped and graded, and again with the consent of both the patient and the physician. The researchers came up with a point score system for verbal communication and nonverbal communication, and the verbal communication scores did not differ by patient race. Now that is gratifying. Let me tell you, that was a huge sigh of relief from me. So in other words, these physicians in this conversation, that end-of-life conversation, they were saying the same things to the black patients that they were to the white patients. But the nonverbal communication scores were significantly lower when they were talking to their black patients. So what do we mean? So the researchers came up with a priori, before the study, a point score system for nonverbal communication. You got a point for each of these. Touch for non-diagnostic purpose. In other words, holding the patient's hand, or hand on the shoulder, or hand on the back. Open body position, which roughly translates into facing the patient. Proximity, being closer to the patient, and eye contact, looking the patient in the eye. So I want to ask you another question. You know, if you and I are lucky enough, or if we're blessed enough, one day our doctors are going to have this conversation with us. So my questions to you are, and I'd like you to please answer yes or no. If that time comes for you and your doctor is having that conversation with you, you know, that conversation that we're going to shift our focus to comfort care. Yes or no? Would you like your doctor during that conversation to be holding your hand? It's okay, you can say yes. Yes, a few yeses. Would you like your doctor to be facing you? Would you like your doctor to be standing close to you? And would you like your doctor to be looking you in the eye? This suggests that if you are white and the physician is white, then you got no worries. That will probably happen. And it's not that these doctors are bad people, but it is how our unconscious biases might make us uncomfortable with somebody who's not like us, and so we treat people differently. And while these seem like subtle differences, I'm sure you agree they can make quite a difference. So I'm going to shift gears, if you will, to one of my other interests, medical school admissions. So what's happening in medical school admissions? Well, what we knew is that physicians have the same level of implicit preference and implicit racial biases as do other individuals. Well, who's on medical school admissions committees? Us, physicians. Largely composed of physicians. We have other people. We have medical students on the admissions committee, and we have PhD basic science faculty. But if implicit bias is present to the same degree on admissions committees, then it's possible that it could be putting certain groups of people at a disadvantage. But little was known about implicit racial bias in medical school admissions, so we decided to study it, and in 2012, We had every member of the admissions committee. We got a big admissions committee. You know, it's Ohio State. We do things big. We have 140 members, 140 people on our admissions committee. And we had them all take 3 implicit association tests, the BlackWhite. There's an interesting one that looks to see if unconsciously you prefer the image of the man at work and the woman at home. And the sexuality IAT. It wasn't optional. If you were going to be on the admissions committee that year, you were going to take these tests. You were the only one who saw your individual results, but we got the aggregate results for our admissions committee. So I want to set this up for you. This is prior to the 2012-2013 cycle. We all took the tests. We had our admissions committee retreat where we talked about the results of that test and had a session on how to reduce implicit bias. And then the 2012-2013 cycle commenced. At the end of that cycle, we then surveyed all committee members to see what they thought of the entire exercise. Here's one of the tests we had them take, the male career stereotype. This one looks to see if unconsciously your unconscious brain prefers man at work, woman at home, and that's not all, has an aversion for woman at work, man at home. I'm going to show you some pictures, and you're going to feel a certain way about them consciously, but it's fun to think about what does your unconscious mind prefer with these images. So people who have the unconscious male career stereotype bias, as an example, they unconsciously, now this is the unconscious mind, they prefer these images, 1, 2, 3. The man with the suit and briefcase going out to take on the world, and the women at home in a domestic role. And that's not all, they have an aversion for or a dislike unconsciously to the woman in the boardroom about to make some decisions and the guys at home. Here are the results of the OSU College of Medicine Admissions Committee. The height of the bars represent the proportion of people in that group who have the male career stereotype bias. On our committee, we have medical students and faculty, men and women. And I can tell you what we're, to this day, still scratching our heads about is that every single woman on the admissions committee unconsciously preferred man at work, woman at home. But not just to pick on the women, look at the rest of the committee, 50% or more. 50% of the committee that decides who gets to be a doctor, let me say this another way, when they look at a woman, they have an easier time picturing her as a homemaker than they do picturing her as a professional. Well, what does that translate into? What if you're in charge of deciding who gets hired, who gets promoted, who gets into medical school? What if you are setting salaries? We do have some interesting data. This data from New York State is one of the important studies about gender discrepancy in salaries. In the state of New York, every newly minted physician who just completed their residency gets a survey from the Center for Healthcare Workforce at SUNY Albany. They've been doing this since 1998. One of the questions on that survey is, what is going to be your starting salary? So the researchers tapped into that database, and they found almost 5,000 men, 3,000 women who met certain criteria. They were all working full-time. 90% or more of their time was in direct patient care. There was no job sharing. There was no half-time working. And they even controlled for, if the specialty was emergency medicine, the same number of shifts worked per month. What they found is that for 28 of 30 specialties, there was, in the starting salaries, an approximately $17,000 pay gap for those newly trained physicians, and the discrepancy was in favor of men. The men made more. Now, if you think that's sobering, what's even more sobering is that this same group, SASO, and all, they have updated their data for 2017. This study was entitled the $16,819 pay gap for newly trained physicians. I can tell you their data from 2017, if they would have used the same cute method for naming the study, it would be called the $27,000 pay gap for newly trained physicians. So it's gotten wider. That's the state of New York. What can you say about New York? Surely that's not happening anywhere else, right? So here's what we're concerned about in medical school admissions, that this young lady comes in for an interview, and the fair-minded faculty member, I love my admissions committee members, They work hard without compensation. You don't get paid for being on the admissions committee. And so our fair-minded faculty member says, you know, I'm a good person. I'm going to look at the objective measures, her experiences, her references, her essay, and her academic record. That's his conscious mind. But if in his unconscious mind, when he looks at her, he sees homemaker, does he grade her essay questions the same way? Does he grade her answers on the interview the same way? Does he look at her list of experiences and put the same value on them? We have some concerns about that. We also had them take this test, the BlackWhite IIT, and if you've taken any of these IITs, what you'll see is that they all ask you, the first question is, they ask you to fess up. So confession is good for the soul. So we ask you, what are your explicit biases? So the BlackWhite IIT starts with this question: what best describes you? I prefer white Americans to black Americans. I like white and black Americans equally. Or I prefer black Americans to white Americans. It records your answer as your explicit bias, and then the test begins to see what is your implicit bias. Well, here are the results of the OSU College of Medicine Admissions Committee. The first two bars are the women, and the graph is showing you the proportion who have white race preference, which is unconsciously a white face means good things and a black face means bad things. The first bar actually is explicit white preference. That means 10% of the women on the admissions committee said, yeah, it's true. I prefer white Americans to black Americans. But when they took the test, 52% had this unconscious white race preference. The next two bars are the men. Like the women, 10% of the men confessed. I prefer white Americans to black Americans, but 64% had this unconscious white race preference. Oh, and one other thing. So we've got medical students on the committee, and so I wanted this information sequestered. I didn't want it to get out until we had the admissions committee retreat. But somehow, as you know, these things always get out a little bit. And I remember the week before the retreat, a medical student coming up to me and said, Dr. Capers, I heard about those results. I think you're going to find that we're a different generation. We're not like those older folks on the admissions committee. We grew up in a different time. I said, okay, I'll see you at the retreat. Medical students versus faculty. The first two bars here are the medical students. Again, 52% had unconscious white race preference. The highest in all recorded groups was the faculty, 69%. So just think for a second, even before we go on, what it can mean for the diversity of our healthcare workforce, for the diversity of physicians in this country, if half, 50 to 70% of the people on the committee that have the awesome responsibility of deciding who gets to be a doctor and who doesn't, that half to 70% of them, when they see this, a black face, their unconscious mind associates it with bad things. What does that mean? And is Ohio State University the only medical school in the country where this is the case? We actually found significant differences by group. So this is showing you the magnitude of the implicit white race preference. And interestingly, although women have it, they have less than half the magnitude of men. Although medical students have it, they have less than half the magnitude of the faculty member. And we actually take this into account when populating our admissions committee. This is not the first time it's been shown that women have less implicit racial bias than men. They just do. It's been shown every time it's been studied. And so we think that if you're putting together a committee that's going to be making important decisions, like who gets promoted, like setting salaries, like who's going to be the next dean, chair, if you want to minimize the implicit racial bias on that committee, you want that committee to be heavy on women. And you want a mix of junior persons and more senior persons. Because here is what we're concerned is happening, that this young man has applied to medical school, he got himself a new suit, he comes in for his interview, he's excited. His future is bright. And that the faculty member, who is fair-minded, says, I'm going to look at the objective measures, but if in his unconscious mind, unbeknownst to that faculty member, blackface equals danger, violence, misery, fear, noncompliance, then I ask you, is he grading this young man's answers on the interview the same way? Is he reading his essay and grading it the same way. We're concerned about that, especially thinking about those one-on-one interviews. Remember how we interact with people that are from a group against which we have a bias. We don't smile as much. We allow them less time to speak, we overtalk them, and we give them less eye contact. Imagine that. Not only, you can imagine it in a patient-physician interaction, but imagine it during your medical school interview. So we'd answered one question. One question we had was, is implicit bias even present in the room when medical school admissions committees get together? The answer was yes. We had two other questions. How do committee members feel about their individual results, and will it have a measurable impact? So remember, at the end of the next cycle, we surveyed the committee. 71% completed the survey. And we gave them some closed-ended questions and open-ended questions. So 67% agreed with this statement: taking the IAT will reduce bias in admissions. 48%, almost half, said I was conscious of my individual results when interviewing candidates in the next cycle. So think about that. In our one-on-one interviews, half of our committee is saying, in the very next cycle, when I'm sitting down with that interviewee, I'm remembering what I got on that test that Dr. Capers made us take. 20%, 1 in 5, said knowledge of my IAT results impacted my admissions decisions. We ended that survey with an open-ended question. Tell us whatever you want to tell us about this exercise, because we want to get better and better. I'll share some of them with you. I don't believe it. I don't believe the results of this test. There are lots of older faculty that I assume would have these old-fashioned opinions. I'm going to guess that was a medical student or a junior faculty member. I am insulted by this test. It states that I have a bias against blacks, women, and homosexuals. I have many colleagues that fit these descriptions that I'm very close to. I myself am a brown person. Rubbish. My IAT said I prefer blacks over whites, yet I feel it would be inappropriate for me to try to compensate for that. Looking at pictures and clicking buttons does not equal how one interacts with a human being. I'm not convinced of any validity of this test. So clearly you can see we didn't convince everybody. It is more likely, and this is an interesting one, it is more likely it creates bias in that it implicitly encourages admission of minority candidates rather than focusing on the content of their character. So I like the fact that in Black History Month, somebody's reading their Martin Luther King. That's good, the content of their character. But actually, we got several like this. Remember, it's a big committee, 140 people. But I'd like to point out something. We found it odd that those few people thought that this is what we're after. That what we're after is to give you a guilt trip. And to give you a guilt trip by showing you you have a bias against blacks, so that now when you're interviewing a black student who doesn't measure up to what we want in the college, that because of your guilt, you're going to give them the thumbs up. When obviously that is not what we were wanting to point out, but we do want to point out this fact. Even the most qualified student of color, if in the interview, the interviewer prefers somebody from a different group, even the most qualified people of color can be at a disadvantage. So let me tell you what, so what I'm sharing with you is what some consider the unfortunate side of that research, that so many of our admissions committee members have these unconscious biases. And by the way, I didn't tell you about all of them. So the majority had unconscious white race preference. The majority, more than 50%, had woman equals homemaker, that bias, and the majority had a negative bias against homosexuals. So that's maybe the unfortunate side. There's a fortunate side. That next class, the very next class we admitted, was the most diverse class in the history of the Ohio State University College of Medicine. And that's because we can overcome and override these biases. We have to first know what they are. Well, let me tell you quickly what happened. So here's what we thought happened, because this is the cycle before the implicit bias exercise, and this is after. The total number of underrepresented minority applicants, blacks, Hispanics, American Indians, went up, but we're always recruiting for more applicants. The proportion interviewed stayed the same. But you look at those offered acceptance, it only went up by an absolute of 1. So we only admitted 1 more underrepresented minority afterwards. But those who enrolled, there was a significant difference of 10% absolute difference 21% relative difference that accounted for our increase from 17% underrepresented minorities in the class to 20%. So in other words, when we dug into the numbers, what we saw was not that after implicit bias training, we admitted more minorities, but after implicit bias training, more of the minorities we admitted decided to matriculate, indicating, or implying at least, that an admissions committee trained in implicit bias reduction techniques interacts with minority candidates in a way that makes them feel more inclusive, like this is a place where I want to go to medical school. So that is our hypothesis. We've published this. It's gotten a lot of attention. That was published in Academic Medicine in 2017. And I want to leave you with some research-proven strategies that we actually train our admissions committee in every year. So these are research-proven strategies to reduce the impact of our unconscious bias. Number one is common identity formation. It turns out that we all belong to certain groups, and by this I don't mean gender or race. By this I mean groups like grew up on a farm, or middle child, or first girl in the family. It turns out if you're in that group, you automatically have a bond with others from that group. And knowing that, simply being made aware of that can reduce your unconscious bias against that person in that one-on-one interaction. So practically, how might this work? Let's say I've taken a test that says I have a bias against people who wear traditional Muslim clothes. There is such a test you can take to see if that's the case. Well, and now I'm going to interview a young lady who's wearing the hijab. I don't want my unconscious bias to put her at a disadvantage, so what can I do? What I can do is during that interview, I can keep probing until I find what common groups she and I share, what common group identity. So I am a big LeBron James fan. It turns out if I find out that she also is a big LeBron James fan, that actually inhibits the neural pathways that activate the unconscious bias. It's that simple. What common group identity do you share? Number two, perspective taking. Take the perspective of a member of the group against which you have an unconscious bias. And this is really try to get inside their head. Let's say I've taken a test that shows I have a bias against women. And now I'm going to interview a young lady for medical school. I don't want my unconscious bias to put her at a disadvantage. So what I can do is I can really try to take her perspective. Not only that day, what does she have to go through to get to me for this interview, but what did she have to go through 6 months ago? Let's go all the way back to elementary school when she had to overcome this notion that girls don't do math and science well. Let's go to her college years where she had to overcome the fact that most science professors are men and they are more likely to take a young man under their wing and mentor than a young woman. All of that she's had to overcome to get here to me today to this interview. If I think about that, I build empathy, and that is the key. Empathy actively opposes unconscious bias. The more empathy you build, the less room there is for unconscious bias. Number three, consider the opposite. When you have data pointing to one conclusion, time out. Don't make a decision just yet. Now, go through this mental exercise. Force yourself to go back through that data one more time, looking for evidence to the opposite conclusion. It's like a game. So if I have gone through a file and I say, you know, what I see in this file tells me that this student, academically, they're not going to be able to cut it in medical school. Before I make a decision, let me go back through that file page by page, looking for evidence to the opposite conclusion. I want to read the letter recommendation from the research PI again, looking for critical thinking. I want to look for events in their life that they overcame, persistence, resilience, that could lead to the conclusion that they will be able to handle medical school. And now I make a decision. That consider the opposite exercise has been shown to blunt the impact of our unconscious racial bias. Counter stereotypical exemplars, spending time with or focusing on individuals you admire from groups against which you have a bias. Now, what this means is that if you take a test that shows you got a bias against group X, there's somebody on planet Earth from group X that you admire. Now, maybe there's somebody that you don't have access to. Maybe it's a celebrity. Let's say I take a test that says I've got a bias against black women. But I like Beyonce. If I read Beyonce, and this is true, if I read Beyonce's autobiography, and I look at a lot of Beyonce's interviews, and I study Beyonce, that can reduce my bias against black women. Now, that's one way to do it remotely with a celebrity or somebody like that, but I prefer doing it up close. And up close, it's simple. Force yourself to spend time with people who are not like you, because you will undoubtedly see some traits that you admire. So these are some strategies, and let me tell you, these strategies work. I know I've gone over, but if you give me 30 more seconds, I want to show you some things that have come out of our implicit bias workshops. Twice a month, I'm doing implicit bias workshops that are 2.5 hours at our medical center, and I've done them at other places. At the end of the workshop, we show this slide, and we ask them to make a pledge to use one of these strategies in some upcoming interaction that you have. And I want to show you what the physicians, not only at Ohio State, but elsewhere, have been making in their pledge. What we do is we type up the pledges and we send them out to everybody to give you a reminder of what you said you were going to work on. I'll be working a night shift this weekend in the ED. When a patient comes in at 2 a.m. for a laceration, instead of assuming they were up to no good, I will consider the opposite. Since my team is very diverse, I've been confronted with and had to deal with getting used to working with a large number of Muslims. But I'm not used to or comfortable with their culture because of all the bad news around the world. So I'm going to use this common identity formation strategy. I'm fine at work, but in my neighborhood, I have a harder time with black single males when I'm out walking. I'm going to try to assume positive intent and say hello and not assume they may accost me. And I will think of positive exemplars I know that are black males. On my next shift, I will most definitely see a patient dressed like a thug. I will take the perspective of the patient and try to imagine their life and their background. As I say at the end of the workshops, nobody, if these implicit biases took decades to bake in, nobody leaves a 2-hour implicit bias workshop cleansed of their implicit biases. But these strategies really do work, and motivated people, which I know we all are, can use them, and we can get closer to doing what we want to do, which of course is treat everybody fairly. Thank you very much. So I'm sorry for going over. Where's John? Did John leave?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. So can we take a few questions? Yep. Okay. Yes.
All tests to be valid have to be validated. How is the IIT validated against what?
So it's been validated as with some of the things that. So thank you for the question. As with some of the studies I showed, it's been validated many times with behaviors. Behaviors such as how we interact with each other, like whether I cut you off when you're speaking, or whether I smile at you when I'm speaking to you, or even in decision making. So people with a bias against group X, physicians even, when they are given choices, therapeutic decisions, there's a tendency, and some studies have shown, not all studies, but in some, there's a tendency to make decisions that are deleterious to group X. So they're validated many ways, but one of the most important ones that we care the most about is in behavior of the people who take those tests. Yes?
Any comment on the current court case that's going through regarding the Harvard admission test, or recent news about the Tokyo University Medical School where they explicitly rated down women, and then the comments from society was, well, I want a woman doctor because they had to score higher to get into the medical school.
Ah, yes, yes. So, so this is so for people who care about admissions and fairness and justice in admissions. These are sleepless times. I mean, we're losing a lot of sleep at night. The Harvard case is interesting. We'll see how it plays out. It could be, especially now that the tenor of the Supreme Court has changed, that we might be in relatively short order living in a country where the mere consideration of race in higher education admissions is against the law. Now, there are some people who probably say, well, I welcome that, you know, and in fact, in my journey in admissions, I many times have had people say to me, I think the only thing that should count is merit. None of that other stuff. It should just be merit. And it is remarkable how similar they are when I then ask them, what do you mean when you say merit? And without fail, when they say merit, they mean the score on the standardized test. And then we talk about the holistic review, and we talk about, for instance, what I just showed you about holding the hand of your dying patient, about looking your dying patient in the eye, about showing compassion. The MCAT doesn't measure any of that stuff. So if we say, you know what, we don't need to interview, we don't need to look at community service, we don't need to look at any of that, let's just have people take a test, and we'll just take the top test scorers. The people who have that philosophy don't take into account the fact that everybody from birth in this country doesn't have the same opportunity to score that same high test. Do you think everybody from birth, if that's the starting line and the finish line is taking the MCAT, you think from birth everybody has the same chance to score the very highest on the MCAT in our society? And that's just a rhetorical question, and some of the questions that we go back and forth. So interesting times, somewhat nervous times for those of us who believe that diversity really helps us in everything that we do. Yes?
So one sad thing from your lecture is that experience doesn't seem to help the situation. I'm imagining a clinical practitioner should be gaining empathy during our careers. And you already said that empathy helps to counteract this. Right, a clinical practice probably exposes us to a broader segment of society than most other jobs. So, any comment as to why that might not be the trend?
Well, that's a very good question. I can only speculate. So one thing I might speculate is that you're right. On our jobs, really no matter where you're working, you're interacting with a lot of patients who have a background different from you. Most of us are anyway. But you're not on your job 24 hours a day. Then you go home and you spend time with your neighbors and you spend time with your family and you watch TV shows that kind of show you a reflection of what makes you comfortable, and you read books that reflect what makes you comfortable. And then you come to work and you work 8 hours. But I think maybe in our unconscious mind, those 8 or 9 or 10 hours of interaction with people who are not like us is overwhelmed by then when we go home and on the weekends and when we're on vacation, we are having the same images that are all around us all the time that lift up certain groups and show the negative aspect of other groups. That's speculation. Thank you. Good question. Yes?
In looking at this type of research, you've talked about race, you've talked about gender in healthcare. You know, what kind of data have you seen around socioeconomic class, for example, or addiction, other types of populations we see where it may not be as race-based versus, you know, those kinds of things, because that's as much an issue now societally in some cases.
Yes. So socioeconomics, there's no doubt, plays a great role in this. And it can be complicated how socioeconomics does that. So we're talking about disparities. But socioeconomics, to a certain extent, you know, how much education you have, the neighborhood you grew up in, and how much money your family has, to a certain extent that could be clouded when I first see you, right? So you could come from a family that's not very well educated, and a family that doesn't have much money, but if you got a decent suit and I see you standing there, if you are in a group that society's images have said, this group means success. All cardiothoracic surgeons look like this. In a certain sense, you can hide some socioeconomics, but no doubt socioeconomics play a great role in healthcare disparities. And these biases really can impact both negatively and positively how we treat people who suffer from addictions. Some of the, I got many other pledges I could show you, but some of the pledges come from people who work with people who are addicted, and some of them are really very moving and say things like, the next time I see a patient who suffers from addiction, I'm not going to walk in the room assuming that they're drug seeking, assuming that they want more drugs, or I'm not going to walk into the room assuming that this person has made a series of bad choices, but I'm going to try to be a little more open-minded. So particularly a vulnerable population like those who are addicted can really fall prey to some of these implicit biases. Yes?
Do you think now that explicit biases seem to be back in vogue, does that skew these tests just because we hear so many episodes of people being openly racist and there's so many YouTube videos and like does that skew how people even like does that seep into people's
Well, you're asking a very good question, because what the unconscious mind starts to see as normal is what it sees a lot of. And so you're right, certain types of explicit biases seem to be making a comeback, if you will. And if we see more and more and more of it, we might feel a certain way about it consciously, but our unconscious mind there is a danger that it'll start to normalize some of this and say that this is the expectation. Yes?
I appreciate your effort at the outset to define terms and distinguishing between implicit bias, explicit bias, and racism. And I think there's something to the way in which intent affects how we're dealing with folks and our behaviors. I am interested, though, in this phenomenon that some of us, and there are a lot of hands that shot up of those who have taken implicit association tests, and some of us may have learned that despite our best attempts and despite our well-meaning efforts, that we might, in our unconscious mind, have implicit bias. What would you say in terms of our responsibility that, I mean, once you know how your unconscious mind may be functioning, it's a little harder to say that, well, I'm not responsible for that, right? Because we know what may be going on. How would you say that, well, maybe we should then have an undue responsibility to then step up and do things like engaging in your strategies to reduce implicit bias, and we become more responsible once we're aware of how our unconscious mind is functioning?
I think it's part and parcel of, not only is it part and parcel of being a physician, physicians want to do the best they can for their patients. If there are 2 antibiotics and study after study says that this antibiotic your patients will do better on, it's part and parcel of a physician that you're supposed to do what you think is going to be best for your patients. So I would say, and I really do believe physicians want to do that. And so that's why we want to get this word out, because you might be using the best surgeries, the best procedures, the best medicines, but there's this other thing that we have to think about to make our patients, help our patients get the best outcomes. And so I would say, if you are a physician, you took an oath to do the best you can for your patients. And if you are being shown that, well, here is something that's keeping you from getting the best outcomes with your patients, that is a part of being a physician. But I'll even go farther than that and say it's just a part of being a good human being, that we all want to treat each other the very best way we can.